The fate of Harvey Weinstein rests with the jury. 7 men and 5 women begin deliberating today after weeks of graphic testimony. The disgraced movie mogul's charges include criminal sex assault and rape. Now, joining us now is Cheryl Bader. She's a former federal prosecutor who teaches criminal law at Fordham Law. Thank you so much for being with us.
It's great to be here.
Now, you've been carefully following the case. So what can we expect to hear from the judge when he charges the jury later this morning?
So the judge is going to give instructions to the jury about the law, and he'll tell them about what rape means, and that the prosecution is required to prove what's called forcible compulsion for the top charges of rape and the predatory assault charge. And what forcible compulsion means is that Harvey Weinstein had to use physical force or the threat of physical force. Okay. For rape in the third degree, it only requires not forcible compulsion, but just that these women expressed clearly that they were not consenting. I think you'll also hear the judge talk about that the prosecution has the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, that Harvey Weinstein has no burden, and that they can't hold against him the fact that he didn't testify. We might also hear the judge talk about the fact that the jury has to consider only the evidence that they've heard in the courtroom and nothing that they might have read prior, and that this case has to rise and fall on the evidence alone and not the merits of the Me Too movement.
Okay, so we heard closing statements from the DA and the defense last week. Who do you think made the stronger case in this?
So I think they both pulled out their guns and did a very good job of playing to their strengths. The prosecution has, the higher burden, and it's a tough case. I have to say that I commend the prosecution for coming forward with a case where the victims have admitted that they engaged in consensual sexual activity with their abuser before or after the rape. But the prosecution is going forward with that this was, predatory behavior, that he ensnared his victims, that he intimidated them from coming forward. The defense, on the other hand, is looking at this as a pay-to-play case, that these women were willing to sleep their way to the marquee, and they're trying to poke as many holes in the prosecution's case, showing that there was inconsistency in the testimony, and that these emails that the women sent are a hole you can drive a truck through. In other words, that they were saying, sending him notes, I miss you, asking for premiere tickets, and that you don't befriend your rapist. So that's their argument.
Okay, and some are saying Weinstein could be acquitted. Now, is that likely? He's charged with 5 crimes against 2 women. Does the jury have an option for a partial verdict? Will the jury makeup be a factor in the deliberations?
So there are 5 charges. Potentially a compromise verdict could be, this sort of third-degree rape, which has a lesser standard. But I think if the jurors believe that this was non-consensual, and they believe these victims, they like them, they want to believe them, then we could see a conviction. I think if they believe that these women were using Harvey Weinstein to further their careers, and they believe that the inconsistencies and the fact that they didn't come forward before, then I think we could see Harvey Weinstein walk with or without his walker.
Okay, and the jury has 5 men and 5 women. So is that makeup, do you think it'll be a factor, play a factor in the deliberations?
So I'm not one that subscribes to stereotypes, but I know that there are many that believe that women are harder on other women, right? That they say to themselves, well, I would be able to extricate myself from this situation. And in fact, it's interesting because the defense attorney, Donna Rotuno, she gave an interview which had sort of some classic blaming the victim rhetoric, where she said, I would not put myself in a situation where I would be sexually assaulted. And I think she's hoping that the female jurors will say that to themselves. But, social science research shows that we're not very good at predicting how we'll respond in any particular situation. But I think that she's hoping that the jurors will sort of, subscribe to that myth that rape is really that stranger that jumps out of the alley with a knife. And that if you don't put yourself in that situation, you wouldn't be raped.
And excuse me, that's 7 men and 5 women in that
Yes,
jury.
That's right. 7 men, 5 women.
Now, was this a harder case to prosecute or defend? I know you said both sides put up a strong fight, but which side do you think had the harder time?
I think the prosecution has the harder time because with consent, there's always going to be gray areas. and gray, translates into reasonable doubt. And there's lots of holes that the prosecution can poke. Look, any relationship is going to be complicated, and when you put it under the microscope of cross-examination, there's going to be inconsistencies and things that don't make sense to other people looking at that relationship. So I think it's a harder case for the prosecution. But the judge allowed the prosecutor to bring in these other women to testify about this pattern in what we call this sort of Molyneux exception to allowing in other bad evidence. And I think that could strengthen the prosecutor's case. We could end up, with a hung jury if the jurors don't, can't agree. And you don't know, once the jury goes into that deliberation room, you don't know who's going to emerge as, a more vocal leader in the group and, what their predisposition is here. So I think it's anyone's guess.
Interesting. We'll leave it there. I guess we'll find out. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Again, that was Cheryl Bader, professor from Fordham Law.